Right, good evening, everybody, and good morning to Britain. Very happy to see you, Tim, and
Great.
I hope everybody can hear me. It's my pleasure to introduce our next keynote, and it's so important. You'll notice the moderator has slipped into the official garb for the event to keep up with the presenter. Unfortunately, we don't have one for this year. I don't know why not. But anyway.
You're too far.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Tim Unwin. Actually, great honor. We're so pleased and fortunate to have Prof. Unwin with us. For those of you who don't know him, he's a chair holder of the UNESCO chair in ICT4D and emeritus professor of geography at Royal Holloway University, London. Actually, Tim, I call him the godfather of ICT4D. I don't know how much you'll appreciate that title, but it's typified by his latest book, Reclaiming ICT4D, which should be essential reading for anybody interested in the subject. So we're extremely fortunate to have him with us today. He's an old friend of ours, as the T-shirt will attest, having taken all the trouble to get up to Backland 2017. And tonight's talk is going to be highly relevant to all our considerations with the eBorneo Knowledge Fair and the wider implications of ICTs for Indigenous development, not only in Borneo, but around the rest of the world. So I'm not going to rattle on anymore. I'll hand over directly to Tim. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roger, everybody, for inviting me. I got the background just before starting, and before I had that, what I'd done is I'd had a different background. So I would like to begin, and I hope what I'm about to say will be intelligible, just by changing the background for a minute and saying Pelaba tabidu pian kuidi riyong mio. Mutudu kadi yui ne karu lem karu ingalis. Du muyu ne muya lawe kudi mine baklalan amenigi barrio lak 2017 malem.
Wow.
So thank you for that. I will now go back to the official, and it's indeed a privilege and an honor to be here, because the world has learnt so much, I think, from the work that everyone at UNIMAS and associated with, and indeed the people of Baklalan and Barrio and the Kelabit Highlands have done. So with luck, I am now going to share my screen, and I have one of those terrible PowerPoint presentations, but with luck you can... I hope we have now coming up a shared... Screen sharing has failed to start. Can I just try again? You can't see that screen, yeah? Hello?
We can't see yet.
Not yet, Tim.
I'll just end show and just try and start again. So share screen. Got
it.
And you've got the full screen version, have you?
Yeah.
Okay, and I hope for those whose... I'm sure I'm one of the few people whose first language is in English. But with luck, you can see Malay translation underneath what I'm saying. Is that working approximately correctly?
It looks good, but I can't attest to the translation.
Excellent, Tim.
Okay, so we get it. So what I'd like to share with you over the next 30 minutes is really asking some difficult questions. I think when you call me a godfather, Roger, this summer I've become a grandfather for the first time, and I think I've become more and more keen on intergenerational collaboration and knowledge sharing, and so what I want to do is ask some challenging questions, and to begin with, really, the first one is, what does it really mean? What are the implications of valuing a landscape such as we see there? What does it mean? How much of that is important to us? And even asking that question, what does that mean? And how does digital technology intersect with this? And I want to also begin by just reflecting a little bit on just how really important the Borneo Knowledge Fair is. I think of all the gatherings and events in the world, and in the period of COVID, I think we've all become utterly sick of digital tech and Zoom meetings. But I think there are 4 or 5 things that I'd just like to congratulate you on. The first is doing things differently. And the way in which this particular edition of the eBKF has been created, enabling people to connect from all over the world, is just a step in that direction. But following what I just said, it's also, I think, about the mutual sharing of ideas across traditional boundaries. The privilege of that drive up to Baklalan in 2017. Not only did we get to know each other on the journey, but we had an opportunity to interact outside traditional lecture theatres and on the ground in places that matter. I think thirdly, and that's really why I would love to be with you and to continue this conversation, is a case I'm going to make to you is that most, in inverted commas, global discussions of sustainability are built upon Western thought, European thought, rather than, and I have problems a little bit with the word indigenous, because I'm indigenous to my country, you're indigenous to yours, but it doesn't quite grapple with the challenges, that word. But I'm interested in learning much more about what inhabitants of these, in the Kelabit Highlands, for example, but also other remote areas, and the people in those pictures I'm just showing, what you really understand by sustainability. I think eBKF enables sharing of voices that are often not heard, and that's a theme I will come back to. But also it reflects UNIMAS's commitment to empowerment and emancipation. So for those reasons, I think it's really important that eBKF carries on what it is doing, and I hope to contribute to that. This gathering's themes, though, are about broadly defined indigenous people and the SDGs. And just as an introduction, I want to reiterate that I believe passionately that it's crucially important that, and again, whatever we understand by indigenous voices or marginalized voices or voices in the wilderness, but it isn't that. It's the heart of the existence of people who live in small island states, for example, that they're heard and acted upon. And I've just written quite a vehement critique of the UN system and the SDGs that's available online, and I could share, because those voices weren't heard in the way in which the SDGs were shaped. Indigenous peoples, again, are seen as one of 13 SDG major groups, but as I'm sure has been said before and you're familiar, only 2 explicit SDG indicators actually address this. And my next slide is going to illustrate that I believe the SDGs have already failed. We need to look beyond them. We need to look to new ways of doing digital and emancipation, empowerment in a different way. And that goes on new notions of sustainability and the way in which digital is positive and negative in the sustainable context. So you may think I'm talking nonsense when I say that the SDGs have already failed, and I know my views on this annoy many people who were involved in shaping the SDGs. However, just a small number of observations. If you couldn't measure the indicators in 2015, it's quite simply impossible to judge by 2030 whether they will have been achieved, because you haven't got a starting place, and a lot of the indicators were insufficiently defined and still are. how many of us can remember all the 17 goals, let alone the 169 targets? And that's important because there are key areas that were missed out of the SDGs that are critically important. And if the world just focuses on these 17 goals, maybe some really, really important issues that can make the world a better place will be forgotten. And particularly in here, I always talk about SDG 10 as the forgotten SDG. All of the other 16 goals are fundamentally about economic growth. SDG 10 is on inequality, and so it is to be welcomed. But you ask people what SDG 10 is, and almost nobody knows. It's often ignored. And actually, if you drill down, and I haven't time here to do it, but I have a slide I could show if you like. But many of the targets aren't actually to do with reducing inequalities. They're to do with other things, and they've been lumped in here to give it some weight. But the fundamental point is I see that economic growth always has within it the potential to increase inequalities. And if we don't address the inequalities, we're going to create a world that is not one that I think many people will want to live in. And finally on this, do the SDGs really represent the interests of some of the poorest and most marginalized communities of the world? No, they address the interests of those who created them, UN agencies, the private sector, and neoliberal capitalism. And that is the fundamental reason why we need to look at sustainable development in very different ways. And so the outline, in brief, what I'd like to say is I want to focus on three themes today. First of all, something about digital tech, and I dipped in earlier in the day. Some of you may have seen me looking at some of the sessions and hearing some of the great things that digital tech can do, but the benefits and the harms. Then I want to say something about sustainability and digital technologies, making the case actually that digital technologies are one of the most damaging groups of activity that affect our environment today. And then talk a little bit about the importance of indigenous understandings of sustainability and empowerment in the context of a world that is becoming much more digital. And I'll then have a final short piece about some of the work we're doing in that area and an invitation for you to join in with it. So first, around digital tech. I think we're moving to a world where if it's possible to do something and scientists say it's the right thing to do, then it will happen. And I don't think, though, that digital technologies are necessarily the solution to all of our problems. And as I put on this slide, just because it's possible to do something doesn't mean it's right to do so. And this illustration may come as a bit of a surprise. I mean, how many people on the unconference today have been digitally chipped? This is a photograph of a person in Europe being digitally chipped, and this is increasingly happening, that people are having a digital chip in their bodies for various reasons. So instead of showing your fingerprint to go into a room, if you're a school teacher or whatever, you just use your chip, or you could use your arm to pay for your meals at the office canteen. Is that right? And I don't think the way in which modern science in Europe, North America, and many parts of the world are constructed enables that question to be answered. Science believes in itself. We need that external view from people in the humanities, philosophers, to actually engage with answering those questions. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a huge number of benefits of digital tech in the contents of the eBorneo Knowledge Fair, and we've heard some of the examples, brilliant examples earlier today. So I'll just very quickly run through this. They enable isolated communities to share knowledge and ideas from different parts of the world coming together. There is a commonality of interest can be created among indigenous peoples. Traditionally isolated digital tech can bring their voices together, and certainly political voice can be increased for dispersed minorities, and we certainly see that in other areas such as LGBTIQ black rights and black matters, or and things that are often called in European North American parlance wokeism, but actually can be terribly important, bringing minorities together. They can be used to share indigenous knowledge about environmental sustainability. I would love to see more of that. And they also clearly enable new forms of economic activity and wealth creation. But I ask again, in whose interests is much of that? And I just want to put up just an illustration of some of the harms. I'm a passionate believer in digital tech and how it can be used. But because, having worked in this field for quite a long time now, and I'm beginning to see that we have to mitigate the harms if we want the benefits to flourish. And all too often we just focus on the benefits and not on the harms. So it's useful at this beginning just to remind us. Firstly, much use of digital technology is exploiting people merely as data. And that is deeply, deeply worrying, that all it means to be human is replaced by just this focus on the economic interests in exploiting that data. And I'm not sure I say this later, but I've sort of launched a hashtag 1 in 7 offline. How many people can actually last? Remember, some of you will remember when Facebook went down for several hours. The crisis that caused was for many people was worrying. So I believe in having a day off a week without any digital tech. And I've just spent 3 days in the mountains away from digital. And it's so refreshing recontacting data and knowing that the big global corporates couldn't know where I was and what I was doing. Digital tech undoubtedly changes cultural and social values in certain interests. How many apps that you use are in your own languages and in your own cultural mores? And we can see here, the arrival of digital tech in Barrio. I think there's often a loss of communal ideas and tradition. Let's not forget that the early computers after the mainframes were called personal computers. They were individual. They weren't called communal computers. And I think that's a really important issue, because neoliberal capitalism is based very much on the individual rather than the communities. And I think we need to shift that balance to how we can create new and better communities. There is undoubtedly, and I work too much on the dark side, but if you haven't experienced the abuse and harassment and digital violence that is out there yet, you're very, very fortunate, because almost certainly one day you will. And the harms, the real harms caused, are a deep worry, particularly for young people. And the point I'm going to focus down on in the last half of what I want to say is that all this digital technology, this explosion of digital technology, 5G sensors everywhere, is leading to a very, very increased demand for energy and raw materials. And the structure of the digital tech sector, I would suggest, is one that is profoundly anti-sustainable. Many of you will have heard of Bitcoin. Bitcoin uses equivalent to about 3/4 of all Malaysia's energy use. That is just Bitcoin, not all the other aspects of crypto, other cryptocurrencies as well, for example. And that's the way it's constructed. So let me move then to that's a lead-in really to sustainability and digital tech, and share with you some thoughts about why digital tech is a major contributor to environmental harms. To be sure, it's being used as a way to reduce carbon, many would argue. But in so doing, it is damaging wonderful environments such as this, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar. So let's think about the environmental impact of digital tech. And I said I was in the mountains just over a week ago, and driving back across northern France, in sort of the northern part of Europe, this was the scene I saw all too often: wind turbine upon wind turbine upon wind turbine. Now, some people they think that picture is aesthetically pleasing. I personally, I think it is harming the traditional landscape and culture. And don't forget that most of those turbines only last 25 years, and they're made of unrecyclable materials, so they will have to go into landfill. And digital tech is one of the factors driving the demand for. So I think my yeah, I would stop, but I think my something's pinging coming in. I apologize for that. So I just want to think around the environmental impact of digital. Computer usage causes twice as much carbon, the latest figures suggesting, than airlines do. And yet everyone's critical of air miles and all the rest of it, not the carbon emissions from computer usage. Hence, partly 1 in 7 offline. The mining of rare earth minerals that are required in our digital devices is leading. We're running out on Earth, so we're going into deep sea mining on ocean floors. Implications of that. None of the environmental models yet are including the pollution from satellites. These huge arrays of satellites that are being, particularly in low Earth orbit, being launched, and the outer space is being treated like oceans used to be, a depository of waste. There's electronic waste with which we're all familiar. The explosion in number of data centers is rapidly leading to increases in energy. And images such as the one on that slide reiterate something that throughout my career I've been interested in, which is the way in which urban elites exploit rural landscapes. And I think just the vocabulary, the word smart cities, to me implies dumb villages. And for those of us who love and live in some of the wonderful rural areas of the world, that's not right. And we have to articulate the reasons why. And I would go even further and suggest that actually most tech business models are deliberately based on an anti-sustainable set of processes. And that's actually not surprising, because digital tech emerged when we had a surplus of energy. We had oil, we had gas, there was lots of energy. We didn't have to worry really very much about electricity. Now electricity is one of the drivers for the reasons why we're having so many unusual climatic events. So if you think about it, most business models are built on obsolescence. I remember a time when we had a radio or television that lasted for years, or a telephone. We never really thought about buying a new one. Now, when did you last get a new phone? 2 years, 4 years, 5 years? If we just kept our mobile phones for twice as long, we would enable all the energy and all the minerals and all the resources that went into them last more and be more sustainable. But we're encouraged always to get the latest new phone. Think about the intersection of hardware and software updates. I always get incredibly frustrated when I buy my old laptop's died, so I have to get a new one, and then actually my old software doesn't run on the new one, so I've got to buy new software. And then when you have software upgrades that actually they no longer work on your old hardware, you have to get new hardware. So there's this vicious cycle that is not exactly sustainable and gives rise, of course, to e-waste. What about the right to repair? In the old days, I remember I used to try and repair nearly everything I had. It's impossible now, and certainly with some computer companies, if you try to repair it, the warranty is gone, and many laptops now you can't actually just take out and put in a new battery. It's all contained, and this right to repair is not permitted. And much digital tech simply ignores the implications that it has for electricity, and we need to make that aware. And I've touched on sort of mineral mining and e-waste, and this is a pile of old digital tech in a school in Africa. What a waste! What a waste! And then so the final thing before I talk a little bit about the work we're doing is the argument that I think much of what I've just said is again based on this notion of scientism, innovation. It's linked to neoliberal capitalism, the individual, and it's a culture that's emerged in Europe, North America, and the countries associated with them Also China, of course, which is trying to compete with that, and we could have a whole separate discussion around what China is doing. But all of those, I think, ignore traditional understandings of what is sustainable and what we need to preserve. Sustainable is very, very different in its meaning from development. Sustainable is about keeping things that one values. Development is fundamentally about change. And again, a landscape from Sarawak and a landscape that I happen to think is beautiful and I happen to think is worth maintaining. What are the implications of that for digital? So I just want to sort of share some thoughts and we need, I think, to develop alternative perspectives to European scientism, and comes back to what I said earlier. Just because it's possible to do something doesn't mean it's right to do it. And it's also much of that scientism is I think based on a positivist tradition that is still really powerful in the bodies of thought that emanate from Europe and North America. And I would like to see much greater attention to hermeneutics, to understanding, which is internal, not just explanation of something out there, if we're actually going to build these new traditions. And a real question, and I think I haven't got the answers to this. It's what I'm working on now. I'm trying to understand is how do different peoples, and I use that term rather than indigenous peoples, how do different communities value the physical environment and sustainability? What if in your village there were to be surrounded by huge wind turbines to enable you to use your mobile device or to have light in your home? How do you approach that? Because I think traditional models of environmental impact analysis are based fundamentally on that European scientism view and don't sufficiently adopt a hermeneutic view. And I think across the world there are many traditional cultures which have traditionally maintained a sustainable balance with the physical environment, and from which we can learn. And the two pictures here I've developed since my work in the Commonwealth a much greater understanding of the values in small island developing states, and these two pictures are from Samoa. And so I think I'm laying out here, I believe it's really important that indigenous sustainability understandings are incorporated much more comprehensively in global dialogues. I'm just wondering, how many people from small island developing states or other different traditional cultures are actually going to be present at COP26 coming up in Glasgow. So before I conclude, I just want to share with you ways that I am personally, but also building a coalition. We're trying to develop ways to bounce back stronger. Apologies for the typo. I've just seen that. I do apologize. And an invitation to just explore. It's easy. It's HTTP, not with S yet, desk.global. And if you follow Instagram and you're young, there's @YouthDesk on Instagram. So I think it's widely accepted that climate change is impacting the world. And you can see lots of examples. This is just one. That climate change is a problem, and we must stop climate change. And that's what COP26 is about. And the way to stop it is, of course, to reduce carbon emissions, what I call the carbon fetish, because the focus is almost exclusively on carbon. And the case I will put before you is that focus means that other environmental aspects are damaged by digital technology. Very simply, climate change, as I've just tried to argue briefly, is usually seen as a cause. So we have climate change here, which causes all sorts of things: ice caps melting, inequality, loss of biodiversity, and I put at the bottom there, add your own favorite, you can add to that. And the way in which the global community, based on, I would argue, the interests of European cultures, North America, the UN system, is to reduce carbon output. And by reducing carbon output, we will solve all the problems of climate change. I think that is a fundamentally flawed approach, because climate change isn't the cause of all those things. Climate change is a result. Climate change is a result, and we need to address that. And if we change our way of thinking and think that it's a pursuit of profit, it's individual greed, it's fast food, fast fashion, fast tech, with our new mobile phones, global governance, demography, all of these things are changing aspects of the environment. Warming temperatures, loss of biodiversity, pollution, carbon emissions, etc. And again, add your favorite. And actually, climate change is just a word that has been created as something concrete, which isn't concrete at all. It is merely an accumulation of parts of that environmental change. And these environmental changes lead to human responses such as conflict, famine, political protest, violence, migration. And I just offer for you a new way of thinking about it, that what we really need to do isn't stop climate change, it's stop many aspects of human activity that we see here. That is the response. It isn't just reducing carbon emissions. So that is a very, very brief overview, but I hope you capture the meaning, because what we've tried to do is to build on that and create a more holistic system through which we can explore how digital technologies influence and are influenced by the physical environment, partly mediated through energy production. And within the yellow background, which is the human context, the social, cultural, political, economic. And the idea is that working as a coalition of interested people from academia, from governments, from civil society organizations, individuals, we can unwrap aspects of that. And that's saying that it's time. My pinger you probably heard just go off, so it's time to close, and I'm just about to. We do that within a clear ethical framework that's about caring for each other and the environment, being the very best we can professionally, and cooperating coherently. So let me conclude. My pinger has gone off. I would like to just share with you some thoughts about, firstly, the importance of moving forward together, but also that we do it action focused. We can shape a future where digital tech is used more wisely and sustainably than it is at present. And I've just got really, I think, 3 or 4 points here. I believe passionately we need to learn how different peoples understand environmental sustainability. And going back to my first question, it's about everyone on this call, in whatever part of the world they are, identifying what we value as individuals, as communities, and what we need to do for them to be maintained. Because the potential impact of the global power and dominance of the digital tech sector is poised to make the world fundamentally different from what we know at the moment. Think back, and I'm shocked by this idea that we're all going to finish up with digital chips in us. But there are people working on that, and they're very powerful people. And the world where the traditional values that we have, the traditional ways of life in the natural world are being changed. Secondly, I believe passionately that we need to mitigate the environmental harms, the many environmental harms caused by digital tech. We need a complete new thinking of that, so that the benefits, the undoubted benefits of digital tech can be fully appreciated. And to do that, I also am convinced that we have to shift from individualistic to communal approaches, or as I say, from me to we, in how we think and how we act. And I hope I've challenged you, and if not convinced you, that if we focus on digital solutions to climate change, that will cause significant environmental harms, and that concerns me. So thank you very much, Roger. I ran over a little bit, but I hope above all I've challenged people on the call, but also encourage us all to work together to think about these issues in new ways. So I will stop sharing and come back to the wonderful backdrop here, and very much I haven't had a chance to look at the chat, but if there are questions, happy to enter a dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. What a wonderful presentation. Just packed with incredibly important issues and comments. I mean, I'm going to spend the rest of the week trying to unpack all that, because there's such a lot to think about, and wonderfully inspirational for our audience, I think. Because, I mean, you mentioned about the idea of sustainability and a sustainable economy, and it brings to my mind the comment that the only people who think you can have economic growth, continuous economic growth from finite natural resources of our planet are either madmen or economists. And yet the only source of any inclination of agreement with that, or even contributing towards that perspective, comes from indigenous representatives and people that we talk to and that you talk to in and around the Highlands and from other places. So I think that's an incredibly important perspective. And I think, as I've said elsewhere, it puts indigenous perspectives, as you're suggesting, it brings them in from the margins to the mainstream. And we could all do much better to take more notice. So I'm looking for some queries, but I have one myself, which is fairly topical, because you might be alarmed. We heard earlier from our community representatives up in Barrio and Baclalan that there was some skepticism around COVID vaccines, and this was being sourced by social media. So you mentioned the environmental harms that technology can do. My question, if I can kick things off, is about this societal harms that social media is creating. And do you think that regulation, which currently seems to be the kind of flavor of the month, do you think regulation will remove those harms that social media is inflicting on society?
Yeah, I thank you, Roger, and thanks for your kind words earlier. I did touch on this a little bit when I mentioned the digital harms, the abuse, sexual harassment. I mean, I would put all of these together, which I think the danger of going too far along the lines that you're encouraging me to is that I don't believe in an instrumental view of digital tech. I profoundly do not believe that digital tech causes anything. It is created by particular interests to deliver what they want to do. And so we have to go back to the interests underlying all digital tech to explain it. It's not the digital tech itself that's causing the harm. It's the interests of the people who are developing it to do particular things. Now, there are unintended consequences as well, but I think in most cases, the harms, in inverted commas, that are caused, such as the anti-vax campaigners, but such as trolling and on all these things, are a direct consequence of the actions of people who are designing the technology in the first place. So the first thing I would say, it is actually up to scientists and business people who design and roll out technology. They are the cause of these things, mainly intentionally, but I admit sometimes unintentionally. So how do we deal with that? I think first of all we have to deal with changing those interests, changing that mentality. After all, what are the figures? 5 of the 8 richest people, all men in the world, have made their fortunes out of digital tech and own more than 80% of everyone else in the world. That isn't right. Our societies, and it's all based on this individual rather than communal interests. So you could say that regulation is a form of communal interest. The trouble is that many of the regulators across the world are, and I'm choosing my words quite carefully, as you say, are let's say, working very closely with the interests of governments. They're rarely, digital regulators are rarely truly independent of the ministries. or the government, or they're working very, very closely with the private sector. Now, I've certainly articulated in the past the view that we need a revision of the regulatory environments so that regulators actually serve the interests of the citizens of country, the people, rather than the private sector. So I would like to see that rebalancing. But I think we shouldn't underestimate what an enormous task that is. The power of the digital tech sector across the world is enormous. And to challenge that, as we see with critiques of Facebook. I mean, there's been whistleblower of Facebook, and yet Facebook has still, the latest announcement, made $9 billion profit. I think the European Union is very much trying to grapple with these things with its new regulatory environments. It's having some success, but it's, to me, rather tinkering at the edges. It's not grappling with the fundamental issues that I began with. So regulation, as it works at the moment, won't have much impact. I'm afraid the UN system as a whole, I see, I exaggerate, but only a little, as totally in the pockets of neoliberal capitalism. The UN is basically serving the interests of global capital rather than the poorest and the most marginalized. And we have to change that. So that's not a route to go. It comes back to creating a culture of we all matter rather than I matter. Roger, okay. We could talk about that, preferably with some nice tea or cold beers next time I'm in Hong Kong or Malaysia.
Right. Thanks, Tim. We have another question I'm going to bring up from John Poor, who you probably met when you were here. He asks, why did the SDGs fail? Is it because of the methods or the framework used?
Big question. John, I haven't got my email, my web page is open at the moment, but if you look up Tim Unwin failure SDGs in a search engine, you'd probably find I've written a couple of long blog posts about that. Why did the SDGs fail? Two or three big starters. Firstly, because they were developed essentially to serve the interests of UN agencies. They were to give UN agencies a role. So they could say, oh, we're focusing on this, and this. Interestingly, digital tech was only mentioned 4 times in the SDGs, and there's been a lot of attempt to catch up on that since. That reflected a failure politically within the UN system of those articulating the importance of digital tech. As Secretary General of the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization, I actually worked with my colleagues to get a coalition of interest in the Commonwealth to actually have some statements more powerfully about digital tech, and was negotiating. But it didn't work. So firstly, the interests of the UN. Secondly, but linked to that, it tried to do too much. Nobody can remember. I mean, no one knows all this. Well, very few. The 17 goals. Nobody, I think, knows all the 169 targets in it, and so that's too many. It was trying to be everything to everyone rather than focusing on the key things that will make this world a better place. So it's trying to serve everybody. I think thirdly, the point I made at the beginning, it was too aspirational. It came up with sort of aims, and if you actually go through and try and quantify the targets, just the data isn't there. I could go on, but those are 3 reasons, and most importantly probably is because they were focusing on economic growth, not reducing inequalities. 16 of the SDGs are fundamentally about economic growth, the belief that if we grow the economy, the benefits will be distributed to everybody, and the world will be a better place. That is complete rubbish. And we have to stand up and say so. Development, I learned 50 years ago when I was, 45 years ago when I was working first in India, that development is about reducing inequalities. And there are these 2 very, very differing intellectual views, but also it's practical. Economic growth increases the potential for inequality. And if you don't do something about that, we will have a more divided society. And look at the wealth of the digital barons. Compare that with people living homeless on the streets of London, let alone, you know, some of the crises areas of this world.
Okay, thank you. I think we have another question that's come up. This is quite interesting. This is from Tran, who I believe is from Vietnam. Could you teach me what are the basic tech tools we can apply in indigenous communities for their development? Oh, that's a good one.
It's a very good one, but it's not my job to teach anybody anything. I see my job as being fundamentally to support. I've written about academics, and for my sins I remain an academic. We should become the servants of the poorest and the most marginalized. We shouldn't be the ones who are determining the research agendas. We need to be servants. And actually, servant leadership is something I've always tried, certainly in my recent career, to do. So I would say, and let me kind of give you a detailed example. We're working on a project on the use of digital technologies to improve the lives of migrants. And it's a huge project. It's 25 million or 20 million pounds. I forget. It's got 140 people in it. And nearly everyone thought that we were going to use all the data they gathered and then develop an app to solve the problems of migrants. Ridiculous. Our approach in our small group is very much to begin by learning how migrants use technology at the moment, then work with them to understand inequalities, but that's incredibly difficult. So understand what they want to change, and then facilitate bringing excuse me, bringing migrants and tech developers together to develop solutions. And one of the solutions, or one of the challenges, is actually how might digital tech reduce sadness? How might digital tech reduce the sadnesses associated with migration? And that's not just video communication and phone communication. It's something much, much more powerful. So that's something we're working on. That's an indirect answer to your question. So let me try and be more direct. I think they go back to that slide that I've shown, and Roger and Nara and Paulina and John and others have been working on this. It is around, I don't like the word communities of practice, but it is linked, or the term, it is linked to that. It's about using the communication aspects of digital tech to build coalitions of shared interests, to share useful knowledges amongst each other. I think, as I hope I showed with my slides, the power of new technology to enable, I think in 5 years' time, probably, if not certainly in 10, I will be able to speak to you in my language, and you will be able to hear it in your language, anywhere in the world, amongst any community. If people want to make that happen and put resources into it. Now, I'm not actually sure that's good, because I think it's very valuable for us all to learn different languages. But that's a separate story. But that way in which we can build communities of shared interests, not so much shared practice. I think some of the rights-based agendas have been very successful in how they've used digital technology as a political process. I think there are opportunities for minority communities. In some ways, is a term I think I prefer more than indigenous, but that's a separate. There's a long discussion around that, and I'm not 100% sure. But to bring coalitions of interest together, learn from the LGBTIQ agenda, learn from Black Rights Matter, learn Black Lives Matter, learn from some of these successful. Now, many of those are very oppositional, and I've always been inspired by the humanity and the care of many indigenous communities. I just throwing out that there's increasing emphasis on empathy, and the importance of empathy and understanding. and care. Do you know the Mahatma Gandhi MGIEP? Let me just put it in the. They're doing some work on happiness and based in New Delhi. It's a UNESCO center. I think, and they're basically they've got together across the world to get thousands of instances of kindness, and then sharing them. I mean, Nara, Roger, why don't we do that? Just little snippets, build a community, little snippets of important lessons from indigenous communities. Sorry, I can't remember whose question that was, but was that from Vietnam? I think it was.
Yeah, Tan. Somebody called Tan.
Oti Maihoa.
Yeah.
Was it? I hope that's some way to answering the question. But in summary, you know most about what you do. Much more than I can ever know. So as an academic, I'm to facilitate and support what you want to achieve. That's really important. Academics don't have the answer to everything, and then secondly, finding the sweet spot, if you like, in digital tech that can enable you to achieve that. That's a long answer, Roger. I apologize, but you know me. I just talk.
Yeah, wonderful. That we're here to listen. Absolutely, we're here to listen. Don't worry about that. So on that basis, there's one last question, if we don't mind slipping over time a little bit. But I think you just answered it. But I'd like to squeeze it in because I find it quite intriguing, and it shifts away from technology very nicely in the way that you just suggested we should do. The question is from, I don't know who it is, an anonymous attendee, but I'll read it out. May I know, what do you think is the most effective way to shift from individualistic to communal way of thinking and acting today?
That's a fantastic question, and one which I should have addressed in some of my writings and never have. I've always said it's important to do so. I think part of my answer is that will vary depending on culture and context. However, I'll be a naughty answer to start with. Given that digital tech is mainly individualistic, let's spread this word of #1 in 7 offline, so that everybody takes 1 day in 7 not online, and that will enable us to open up new ways. That's a slightly trite answer, anonymous attendee, but more thoughtfully, I think it's important. But it's let me think 3 things. One is learn from cultures that remain communal. I think that's true. And in many ways, and I know there are differing views about China, but I have to admit that my son got me. I don't know how many of you have read this, Xi Jinping's Governance of China. Really interesting. Rhetoric and reality, but some of the stuff in there about the party serving the interests of the people and communal interests is really important. So learn from examples of good communal cultures. I mean, fundamentally, whoever asked the question, it's about changing the nature of the world economy, which is fundamentally based. I see the US as a failed state, and that China is the present, not the future. We have to learn to work with China. It's not up to a tiny little country on the northwest of Europe, to tell China what to do. There are crazy things going on, but we have to fundamentally change, and we are changing. The world is changing, but US global dominance is part of the problem, because it's US is about me. It's about me. It's about me. It's not a communal. And look at the way it was founded. And thirdly, and this is it follows a progression, and I have written a bit about this, but it's very provocative, and it offends some people, so I apologize. And but the case is we have to move from a rights-based agenda to a responsibilities-based agenda. Much of the UN system, but when they can't come up with a problem, it says the human rights. So let me give you an example. It's a right to have education. Fine, but if a government doesn't believe in providing free education for its citizens, that will never happen. If people have a right to life, if a government or a warlord doesn't believe in that, they will kill you. So we have to and it's a long argument, but the human rights-based agenda is fundamentally to do with giving labor, enabling global capital to access labor for free. So you are free. You're not a serf, or you are free to sell your labor to the capitalists. You're also free to be a market. So that's at the heart of human rights and why it links to global capital. So if we shift that to an agenda which says, I am responsible for you, or a government is responsible for its citizens, or a family is responsible, and we focus on responsibilities rather than rights, that will begin to change things. That is a huge agenda. But it's one that I'm writing about. It's very easy for it to be misunderstood. But fundamentally, it's about shifting from, rights. You say, I have a right to have something. Well, hey, there are responsibilities around that. I hope that I'm provocative, but it's part of the jobs of an academic to challenge, I think. So I hope, Roger.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Lovely thoughts. Pauline is waving her hand. So go ahead, Pauline.
Yeah. Hi, Professor Tim. It was lovely to see you again, and
adieu.
A very intriguing lecture. This the keynote. Very much a lot to think about, to think through. I like your comments about the tension between we and I. And for me, growing up in the Longhouse, and it's very communal in the sense that we used to say the only thing that we don't share in the Longhouse is one's husband or one's wife. So you literally shared everything. And in fact, when we grew up, we were taught to, even if you have 1 grain of rice, if you had someone next to you, you need to share with the other person. So I must admit that Roger and Nara had difficulty trying to dealing with me, trying to tell them when we present something, we must always use the word we. And then the two of them look at me and the moment they say I say, no, it's not I, it is we as a team working on this. So now I hope the two of them now have some sort of enlightenment from your presentation today, why it is an issue for me with the word I most of the time. And I think you pointed some really good reasons for why that is. But I think one of the most influential reasons why the I becomes so much important in the we is our education system itself. The way we were educated to compete with each other in school, and from my growing up in Barrio, and that was such a dilemma for me, because I will always be getting number 1 in the class. Then at the end of the term, I have to go up on stage to get the prize, and I get number 1 for history, geography, and except for mathematics, and so it's almost towards the end of the term, I will be trembling, thinking about, oh my God, this is going to be such a torture for me to go for the graduation ceremony, because it's this idea of you have to compete with your friends and who happen to be your cousins, and you stand out. So that whole idea that you are single, and that goes into our writing as well. I think when we do our dissertation, for instance, we used to say perhaps some of our dissertation are written with the community. For instance, from me writing with about villages in Barre. At the end of the day, the dissertation is produced by Pauline Bala, and it is an individual exercise. So there's so many occasions for us to rethink through these things. And I know in in UNIMAS we try to say collaborative writing, co-authoring papers is much better than single authoring. But when it comes to KPI, this is single authoring is given more weight than co-authoring papers, working as a community. So I think there are many ways that this thing of individualism is inculcated in us, and we need to think through even in the daily lives and our interaction. But thank you.
It's lovely to hear. I was just looking. I was going to put on my background. I've got some lovely pictures of longhouses that show just what you're saying. Two things I would pick out of it. Yes, I absolutely education systems matter, and I fear. I mean, in some of my writing, I've been very explicit, but I very much fear for the future of education, particularly higher education, which is, I think, rather than being critical, open, collaborative thinking is very learn, regurgitate, repetitive, and that's hugely damaging because it serves the interests of those in power. So changing the education system is really important. I think there have been changes along that way that to destructure the model of the first. And again, this might sound very right-wing, although everything I've said before has been pretty left-wing. But I think there's been an incredible lowering of standards as a result of changes that have been made. And so I think striving for excellence and rigor, which you as a young woman and girl coming first actually matters because you're striving for excellence. And you weren't first in everything. None of us are. But I believe passionately that we need excellence in education, and we're losing that. It should be always about pushing the boundaries. So while I agree, I think there are some difficult issues around that, and communal writing, I think is increasingly happening globally. I mean, my younger daughter is an academic, and she's often in papers with about 30 authors, and the competition for who is first or who is included in the first authors, the second authors, and it differs in different disciplines. I've learnt that being last author actually means you're the overall boss of the project. So that's really important. But I could forgive me, dear academics here. Academia is a game, but actually, we as academics can choose to alter the rules of the game. We tend not to. We tend to succumb to the citation index. I won't say what I was going to say. But I've increasingly stopped publishing in academic journals because I think nobody ever reads them, the papers. You can't publish original stuff in papers because the journals constrain what you do. Anyway, sorry, but I think basically we're aligned, and yes, it will be. I look forward to our next meeting. You must all be very tired, and I should have said thank you so much for shifting the time. I mean, I was prepared to speak at 3 in the morning my time. I did that for a Korean conference not so long ago. It isn't pleasant, so I'm immensely grateful to you all for staying on longer at the end of the day, so you get me in a brighter state of mind.
No, it's fine. The timing is just perfect. I know, I mean, it's not that late for us and a good time for you, so that's perfect. So thank you, Tim, for all that. What a wonderful presentation. I'm so happy we've been able to connect again. And I think your first presentation in 2017 had a big impact on me, and I know on a lot of other people. And I think this one's going to have the same impact going forward once again. So thanks again. We're so grateful to have you spend your time with us. And we've certainly, I for one, and I'm sure everybody else, we've learned a lot to think about and a lot to move forward with. So thanks again for that.
Thanks. Can I say one final thanks for your very generous comments. Leanne Tarawa in Barrio did the translation for me. So if any of you know him, could you please thank him very much indeed. He may be on this conversation, I don't know, but I acknowledge his hospitality. And I'd like once again to thank the hospitality in 2017 of everyone I met in Baklalan and Barrio. It was a very special time, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. Thank you.
Great, that's good for them. Most welcome. I hope we'll be able to do this again sometime not too distant future. So, but before, sorry, before we leave, I've been asked that we can make a photo, but I for one don't know how to do that. So Nara, if you can give instructions, and perhaps somebody can do that for us.
Switch on your cameras, everyone who's here with us today. If you want a photograph with Professor Tim Unwin, and Dr. Roger will count to 1, 2, 3, and that's it.
We still need some more faces, yeah.
Well, is everybody on?
Is that everybody?
Okay.
Change the setting from the panelists separated from the attendees, Roger. Nara.
Okay.
Okay, so that's it. Okay. Satu, dua, tiga.
Okay.
Okay.
Can I also post that on my own social media?
We'll send you a copy. Yeah.
No, I've got it. I did it. But I've been trying to publicize it, as you noticed, through Facebook and Twitter. So lovely to see you all. Take care.
Yeah.
And may your families remain healthy in these difficult times.
Thank you, Tim. All the best.
Thank you, Tim. See you all at 9 o'clock tomorrow. Have a nice day.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.